When Karen and I got married, we were both still in school. She had a year of teacher's college at Queen's ahead of her, and I had 3 years of seminary to complete. So we didn't have a lot of money. That is not quite right. We didn't have any money. So we purchased our wedding bands at Consumers Distributing. Do you remember that store? Buying wedding bands at Consumers Distributing would be today like buying them at Giant Tiger or KW Surplus. My wedding band never fit very well. It had sharp edges that dug into my finger, and so I took every opportunity and made every excuse not to wear it. I don't know if this bothered Karen so much, but 5 years later she presented me with a new wedding band, bought from a reputable jeweler, made of real gold, and said I now had no excuse not to wear it. And it fit. It was actually a little loose on my finger. That same summer I had been conned into coaching the Pee Wee's boys fastball team in Shakespeare. A few days later I was down at the ballpark holding a practice for the fastball team. Earlier that day it had rained. It was a muddy field. I had been wearing my ring. Later that night, sometime after 11 o'clock, I looked at my left hand and to my horror noticed that my ring was gone. And I knew immediately where I lost it, somewhere on that muddy ballpark. I knew it was hopeless. I would never find it, so I decided I had two options. One, I could tell Karen what had happened, or two, I could try for the rest of my natural life to conceal the fact that I had lost the ring. After Karen went to bed, I got in the car and drove down to the muddy ballpark. It was dark and wet, and I thought, this is hopeless. I will never find that ring. But in one last desperate effort to find the ring, I shined the car lights over the muddy field, and I looked out and saw a tiny golden sparkle near the backstop. And I went over and on my hands and knees pulled out of the mud my wedding ring. If anyone had seen me that night holding the ring in the air, whooping and hollering, prancing around the field like I had won $1 million, they would have surely called the police. But I could not help it. The lost was found, and the feeling of joy was indescribable. I wanted to have a party. In our text this morning, Jesus tells two similar stories. Two little stories about a shepherd and a woman searching for their lost treasures, and the joy that is occasioned when that which is lost is found. In Jesus' day, what you ate and who you ate with were critical matters. It doesn't make as much sense to us today with fast food restaurants and family meals around the TV, but eating together in Jesus' day was a religious experience. Eating together was a celebration of faith, which included very specific rules about what happened around the table. And cleanliness was very important. Clean food, clean dishes, and clean hearts before you came to the table. And Jesus consistently offended people by ignoring these religious table manners. Jesus regularly upset the religious folks by breaking bread with the wrong kind of people, tax collectors, prostitutes, Samaritans, the unclean. If we were to try to update this story for our modern culture and sensibilities, we might envision Jesus at a table with a drug dealer, an illegal gun runner, a young man with Ebola, a teenage meth addict, and a Syrian refugee thrown in for good measure. It is not a place that any of us would likely find ourselves, but somehow we can imagine Jesus at the head of the table like that, asking the young drug addict to please pass the salt. If we were to see such a table, Some of us might join the Pharisees in complaining about who Jesus is sitting with. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. When the Pharisees grumbled about this, Jesus told these two parables about the shepherd who left the 99 sheep to go looking for the lost and invited his friends to come over and celebrate upon finding the one. And then Jesus told about a woman who had 10 coins. She lost one of them, so she set everything aside until she found it. And then she called her friends and neighbors together to join her at the table to celebrate the finding of the one coin. And I understand wanting to have a celebration, for on that late summer night when I found my wedding ring in the mud, I wanted to have a celebration too. The religious leaders are complaining that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners, and in response, Jesus tells these parables, finding a lost sheep and finding a lost coin, and how there will be such a celebration when they are found. Rejoice with me, for what was lost has been found. The key to these stories, I think, is the celebration. The key to the stories Jesus told is not that they searched for the one and found it, but that when they found what was lost, they invited everybody over and held a celebration. And at the end of both of these stories, you notice the invitation. Rejoice with me, for what was lost has been found. The question for the Pharisees and the religious people of the day, and maybe the question for us, is simply, will we join in this celebration? Will we find our way to the table when God celebrates the return of one of his children, even if it is somebody who is not like us and someone who is unworthy of God's love by our own particular standards? Maybe that is the question for us today. Can you handle a party for someone you don't approve of? Jim Barnett is a religion professor at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama, and a co-pastor of a church there. In an excellent sermon, he tells about Donnie, a man with a drinking problem, homeless, who would often show up at their church in Birmingham. When Donnie was not at the church, he would wander the 5 Points area of Birmingham, asking for money. Jim Burnett remembers seeing the tiny bruises on his face, put there by a suited man who threw a handful of pennies in his face at point-blank range. He remembers Donnie telling him to imagine an entire day when your eyes do not meet someone else's, because not one person looks at you directly in the face. He remembers Donnie telling him how frightening some streets are at night, where screams are commonplace enough that no one even looks up to identify the source. But often Donnie would find his way back to the church, and there he would be found by those who watched for him, who ministered to him. He knew that among those sinners there was always a place for him at the table. It was a bit awkward, though, on the day when Donnie stumbled into the room with new guests and prospects who had gathered for coffee to learn more about the church. A middle-aged woman in finely coiffed hair and a pearl necklace made a nervous attempt at conversation with him. She said, "Donnie, this is such a beautiful old church, especially the sanctuary. What is your favorite part of it?" Donnie looked at her with bleary but eager eyes and replied, "Hey, I don't play favorites. I love all of you." No one knew exactly what he meant by that. Most assumed that it didn't make any sense. "Oh," the woman attempted to clarify, I mean the sanctuary where we just worshipped?" "Oh," said Donnie with his crooked grin. "Well, I mean the sanctuary you give me. I don't play favorites. I love all of you." Jim Barnett says, I'm still not sure if Donnie was sober when he said that, but upon hearing it, the rest of us were. Neil White has written an interesting memoir entitled In the Sanctuary of Outcasts. In it, White recounts his 18-month federal prison sentence for bank fraud. Neil is not sent to an ordinary prison, but to a leprosarium in Carville, Louisiana, the last place like it in North America. He and other prison inmates, many of them convicted of similar white-collar crimes, share building space with the last people in America disfigured by leprosy. In the early days of his stay, Neil does everything possible to avoid being near the Hansen's diseased outcasts. He keeps his distance, even holding his breath if they come close to him. But over time he befriends a number of them, and he comes to admire their tenacity as they cope with the cruelty of their condition and the indifference of the world that has all but forgotten them. One evening, the lepers are holding their annual spring dance. Neil and a couple of other white-collar inmates are assigned to set up tables and chairs and unload the sound equipment in the patient ballroom. The DJ begins pumping music out of the speakers before Neil and the other inmates can exit. Patients limp and wheel and slide their walkers onto the dance floor. Bandaged hands are lifted, wheelchairs are shimmying, and disfigured faces are beaming. An elderly woman motions for Neil and offers her hand. In a moment of joyful connection, Neil receives her hand and follows out onto the dance floor. Suddenly, two more prison inmates find themselves dancing among the patients. The first song ends, and the patients clap as best they can. Suddenly, a loud shout brings the celebration to a screeching halt. From his wheelchair, a leper named Smeltzer declares, "You're not invited. No inmates at our party." The room falls silent. Smiles disappear. The moment of joy passes. "You're not welcome here," Smeltzer yells. "Go on, get out." Quietly, the four inmates lumber toward the exit door. And as they pass through the door, an inmate looks at Neil and breaks the silence. Good God, did we just get kicked out of a leper's dance? The good news is that in Christ's ballroom there is space for everyone, even for the clean, healthy, antiseptic, righteous non-lepers of this world. There is a place at the table for the dullest of Pharisees, and yes, for the dirtiest of sinners, people like you and like me. There is room for the most aimless of sheep and the most hidden of coins. And always, always, there is rejoicing.
I've no need to be reminded of all my failures and my sins, for I can write my own indictment of who I am and who I've been. I know that grace, by definition, is something I can never earn. But for all the things that I may have missed, there's a lesson I believe that I have learned. There's a hand of kindness holding me, holding me. There's a hand of kindness holding me, holding on to me. Sometimes the consequences last, and it's hard to walk inside that mercy when the present is so tied up to the past. In this crucible of cause and effect, I walk the wire without a net, and I wonder if I'll ever fall too far, but that day has not happened yet, 'cause there's a hand of kindness holding me, holding me. There's a hand of kindness holding me, holding on to me. And in the raven dark, there shines a distant light. It seems to point at me. It burns away the night. Familiar figure on horizon, moving closer now I see. His heart is shining like the sun. He's reaching out for me.